Welcome to another episode of Philosophy and Critical Thinking. In this video, we are going to discuss Honora O'Neill's article, A Simplified Account of Kant's Ethics. So Immanuel Kant was an 18th century German philosopher who developed a very systematic account of what's often known as the deontological approach in ethics. Deontology is the opposite of what we called consequentialism in the last video. So recall that according to consequentialism, the rightness of an action is determined exclusively by the results or the outcome of the action. According to deontology, what makes an action right or wrong is something about its intrinsic nature. So according to deontology, take an example like killing an innocent person. There's something intrinsically bad about the action of killing an innocent person. It's not the case that the action's wrong because it has bad consequences, but there's some other reason having to do with the action itself. So in this article, O'Neill is discussing Kant's theory, and she's going to focus in particular on one of Kant's basic ethical principles that he calls the formula of the end in itself. It is a version of what Kant calls the categorical imperative. And by that, Kant simply means a general principle that's universally binding on all rational beings. So every being that has the power of reason or the capacity for reason and rationality would be subject to the categorical imperative. It's a general moral truth that's objective, necessary, and universally binding. All right, so the formula of the end in itself says this: act in such a way that you always treat humanity, whether in your own person or in the person of any other, never simply as a means, but always at the same time as an end. What Kant means by this is that we should always treat other people as people rather than mere things. If we are willing to sacrifice one person by intentionally killing them for the sake of saving, say, 5 other people, then we are treating the one person as a mere thing that is getting in the way of overall happiness. Or maybe we use them in a particular way for the sake of the greater happiness. That would be morally wrong according to the formula of the end in itself. This formula expresses what Kant calls a universalizable maxim. A maxim, in Kant's view, is just a general principle or policy that underlies one's intention behind one's action. So imagine the following concrete example. I need some money. I have a gambling addiction, and I know that if I borrow money from you, I won't be able to pay it back. But I really need the money, and so I resolve to make a false promise to you. I say, if you lend me $50 today, I will repay you 1 week from today, knowing full well that I won't be able to repay you. All right, the intention underlying my action here is not a good intention. The principle or policy that underlies my intention is something like this: make a false promise whenever it benefits me. And that is not an example of what Kant would call a universalizable maxim. All right. As a rational being, you could not will or decide to live in a world where everyone acted in accordance with this kind of policy or principle. Make a false promise whenever it benefits you. In fact, if you try to imagine a world where everyone acts in accordance with that principle, the very activity of making promises breaks down. No one would trust a promise made by anyone if everyone were acting in accordance with the maxim, make a false promise whenever it benefits me. And if promises can't be trusted, there's no point in making them. So the idea here is that the very activity of making a false promise undermines itself. If the intention behind my action is to make a false promise whenever it benefits me, I'm essentially saying to myself, it's okay for me to make a false promise because it's going to benefit me, but it would not be okay for anyone else in my shoes to do this. Right? And that is a contradiction of sorts. It's a contradiction in the act of willing or deciding to act in accordance with this maxim. Behaving in accordance with this maxim would mean that I'm treating others as mere things, as merely useful or instrumental to my own goals. I'm not treating them as ends in themselves or as beings that have intrinsic worth, dignity, their own autonomy, and so should be treated accordingly. Now, this doesn't mean that all uses of other people are immoral. Right? Kant's view is that we should never use others as mere means. But sometimes people can give their own consent to being used in various ways. So if you have an electrician that you're hiring for their service and they agree to work in exchange for, say, $300, to fix your electrical outlets, then you're entering into an agreement with this person, and you know full well what the service is going to be, they know full well what the payment's going to be, and there's no mystery about how people are being used in this case. So bank transactions, employer-employee relationships with mutual consent, these are examples of legitimate ethical uses of other people. Unacceptable uses of other people include situations where there's manipulation, there's deception, there's coercion. A person is being used as a mere means in the sense that their autonomy is not being respected. They're not being given all of the information, or they're being coerced into doing something that's not really in their best interest. In Kant's view, we have a strict duty to never treat others as mere means. And this strict duty is a duty of justice. It is unjust to treat others as mere things. So to compare Kant's ethics with utilitarianism, Kant's ethics focuses on our intentions rather than on the consequences of our actions. And it provides a very precise, basic moral rule that we must always follow. Never use other people for the sake of the greater happiness. Whereas utilitarianism focuses exclusively on the consequences and says that the right action is the one that has the best consequences. This requires calculation of the likely happiness or suffering that would result from an action. On Kant's ethics, although consequences aren't unimportant, they don't exclusively determine the rightness of an action. If you want to know what makes an action right, you have to focus on the intention and figure out whether or not the intention is in accordance with this categorical imperative, the formula of the end in itself.